We're diving into a really tense situation in the Middle East today. We're looking at the possibility of another major conflict, this time centered around Lebanon, and the potential for things to escalate dramatically between Israel and Hezbollah.
Right, and we've got some concerning news coming out of the region. You shared some Arab news articles with me, all dated September 21st and 22nd, 2024, and they paint a pretty stark picture.
Let's jump right in with the most recent and honestly strange development. We're hearing reports about exploding pagers and walkie-talkies in Lebanon.
Yeah, it sounds almost unbelievable. And tragically, it's led to a lot of civilian casualties.
The reports mention 37 dead and over 3,000 injured. And it gets even more unsettling. These weren't just regular bombings.
Right, the devices were apparently rigged to go off when someone tried to examine them like some kind of awful preemptive strike.
That's a chilling detail. And to my knowledge, it's not a tactic we've seen Hezbollah use before. They're usually much more overt in their attacks.
Exactly. This targeting of individuals, and with such a calculated method, makes you wonder about their strategy here and what kind of intelligence they might be acting on.
On top of all this, we have UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres making a pretty stark statement to Arab news.
He's issued a warning saying, "We cannot allow Lebanon to become another Gaza."
And this from Guterres, of all people. He's known for his diplomacy, wouldn't you say? Hearing him use such strong language really underscores the gravity of the situation.
Absolutely. He's drawing a direct comparison between what's happening in Lebanon now and the devastating year-long war that erupted in Gaza after the Hamas attack on Israel.
Gaza has been in a state of constant crisis for almost a year now, a truly dire humanitarian situation.
And it seems Guterres sees these recent events in Lebanon, especially if it turns out they're linked to Israeli actions, as something that could easily spiral into a similar catastrophe. He even used the phrase "avoid at all costs," which really emphasizes how seriously he's taking this.
He's clearly very concerned. And it's not just the methods, is it? It seems like Guterres is also getting increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress in ending the fighting in Gaza.
Definitely. It's been almost a year since that conflict began, and there's been little to no progress on negotiating a ceasefire.
He's been calling for an end to the violence from the very beginning, hasn't he? But nothing seems to be working.
It really highlights the limitations of the UN, doesn't it? I mean, they have a global platform and the moral authority to condemn these actions, to call for peace, but actually enforcing those decisions, that's a whole other story.
Especially when you consider the current makeup of the Security Council. They're so divided on this.
Absolutely. It's like that old criticism, about the UN just handing out sandwiches at the gates of Auschwitz. Except now they can't even get aid into Gaza effectively.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It really underscores just how difficult it is to find a peaceful resolution to this kind of conflict, this level of entrenchment. It's incredibly complex.
Speaking of complex, I think we have to address the elephant in the room here. The situation in Gaza has become so dire that some legal experts are even raising the question of genocide.
Right, and it is a heavy word to use, genocide. It's not something to throw around lightly. It has a very specific legal definition.
Of course, and we have to be very careful about how we use it.
But we also can't ignore the fact that the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, issued a pretty significant ruling back in January.
Right, their highest court.
And they stated very clearly that there's a risk of genocide in Gaza. Now, that's not a declaration of genocide, but it carries a lot of weight, and it raises serious questions about the ongoing humanitarian crisis there.
So how is the UN responding to that? I mean, they're the ones who ultimately have to grapple with that judgment.
Well, it puts them in a really tricky position, doesn't it? They have to uphold the decisions of their own court, but at the same time, they're trying to navigate these incredibly sensitive international relations. It's a real balancing act.
It makes you wonder if they even have the tools to handle something like this.
It's a valid question. And all of this is happening against the backdrop of rising tensions across the entire region. You shared those articles about Iran's supreme leader condemning Israel, and there were reports of Hezbollah firing rockets into Israel just the other day.
It really does feel like the whole region is just a tinderbox right now, doesn't it? Like any one of these incidents could be the spark that ignites a much larger conflict.
It's that interconnectedness that makes this situation so volatile. Whatever happens in Gaza doesn't stay in Gaza. It has ripple effects across the whole region, inflaming tensions that are already at a boiling point.
So much happening at once. It's hard to wrap your head around it. And it all circles back to that question of a two-state solution, which feels almost naive to even bring up at this point.
Right. It's been the go-to proposition for decades now. But every time it seems like there's a chance, a glimmer of hope, another wave of violence just washes it all away.
It does make you wonder if it's even a remotely realistic goal in the current climate. With all these tensions flaring up, not just between Israel and Palestine, but across the entire region.
I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Honestly, it's hard to look at the current situation and feel much optimism. The two-state solution, which for so long was seen as, the most viable path to peace, it's just become so incredibly difficult to achieve.
It feels like it's bogged down by so much. The political complexities, the deep mistrust on both sides, and, frankly, a lack of real political will to make it happen.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
almost as if people are afraid to even hope for peace anymore, because every time they do, they just get crushed by disappointment.
It's understandable, but
So if not a two-state solution, then what? What other options are there? What are people even talking about as an alternative?
that's what more people should be asking. I mean, there are some voices advocating for a single binational state
Hmm.
where Israelis and Palestinians, everyone would share equal rights, equal representation.
Interesting, but I imagine that comes with a whole other set of challenges.
Oh, absolutely. On paper, it sounds great, but the reality is there are a lot of complexities, especially when it comes to issues of identity, security, how to actually share power in a meaningful way.
Right, it's not just a matter of drawing lines on a map, is it?
Exactly. And you have to consider the historical baggage, the decades of mistrust. It all plays a role. That's exactly why it's so crucial to understand the deeper context of this conflict. I mean, the historical grievances, the competing narratives, the power dynamics at play, you have to take all of that into account if you want to find any kind of viable solution.
And even if we feel like we've wrapped our heads around those complexities, we're still left with these very real limitations of what an organization like the UN can actually accomplish. They can urge, they can condemn, but ultimately they can't force peace on anyone, can they?
You're right. And for all their aspirations, the UN is only as effective as the countries that make it up.
It's kind of a depressing thought when you really let it sink in.
It's the truth, though. In the end, the responsibility lies with individual nations, with their leaders, and with their citizens to say, enough. We demand better. We want peaceful solutions. They have to hold their governments accountable for the choices they're making.
So where does that leave, the average person, someone like me or you or anyone listening to this who may not have a direct line to the UN or to their head of state? What can we even do in the face of such an overwhelming conflict? What can we possibly do that would actually make a difference?
Well, I think the first and maybe the most important thing is we can't turn away. We can't just shut it out because it's too much, too depressing, too complex. Staying informed, engaging in these difficult conversations, and really being willing to challenge our own assumptions, those are crucial steps.
That's a good point. It's easy to just skim the headlines and feel overwhelmed, but you're saying we need to dig deeper.
Yes. It's about going beyond those headlines, digging into the nuances of the conflict, really acknowledging the humanity of everyone involved, no matter where we stand politically.
I get what you're saying. It's easy to feel helpless in these situations, but even small actions can contribute to some kind of larger shift.
Exactly. Every voice that speaks up against the violence, every conversation that tries to build bridges of understanding, it all chips away at that wall of indifference and apathy. It's about changing the narrative from one of despair and hopelessness to one of hope, from a narrative of violence to one of peaceful coexistence.
It's a tall order, but I like your optimism.
Someone's got to have it.
Well said. So, to our listener out there, to everyone who's been with us on this heavy, heavy topic, we're going to leave you with this final thought. As tensions continue to escalate in Lebanon and the shadow of what's happening in Gaza looms large, the question we all need to ask ourselves is, what role will we choose to play in this story as it continues to unfold? Will we be passive bystanders, or will we find ways to actively contribute to a more peaceful future, however daunting that task may seem?